Out there, Dan here, aka the Comic Concierge, and this is my top 10 weekly countdown where I go through all the books I read in the past week and give you my top 10 favorites. But before we get into the good, I do like to discuss the bad, so let's get into my most disappointing comic of the week. I do feel like I might be losing some people right away with my choice for most disappointing book of the week, and the thing I need to put up front is the fact that just because a book is disappointing doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. I mean, it just wasn't what I was looking for, maybe wasn't the type of read I was hoping for. So this week's disappointment of the week goes to Department of Truth number 11. I'm saying I actually enjoy this series for the most part, but I feel like I have this weird relationship with the book where sometimes I just find myself not enjoying it. It's great to look at. I love the aesthetic of the book, especially this issue, but unfortunately I don't enjoy reading it sometimes. That was definitely the case with this issue. I feel like this leans into some of James Tynion's worst tendencies, especially his knack for kind of overwriting at times, putting way too much on the page, and that was the case here, where I just felt like you had these prose-like pages that weren't all that enthralling to read. I also struggled to read a lot of those pages due to the general look of the book, and I get aesthetically it fits into the theme of the book, but when those aesthetics override comprehension, I think you've kind of run into a bit of a problem. I feel like this book tends to spin its wheels a bunch, really since the first arc, where its commentary is a bit thin and repetitive, and it ends up saying a lot but not saying much at all. And I think that was the case with this issue. Is it a bad issue? Not necessarily. Is it poorly constructed? No. I just, at the end of the day, didn't get anything out of it that I was hoping for. And for a series that I just really feel like has a lot of potential, it's just not clicking with me the way it should. I know I'm probably in the minority with this, because I do know a lot of people still love this book, and I will continue to do so. I just wish I was one of them. Now let's get into my actual top 10 by looking at number 10 for this week. And I don't do a weekly surprise, but this would be the case for my number 10 this week with BRZRKR number 4. This has been a series that actually was kind of close to dropping because I felt like it too was being a bit repetitive. A lot of interesting action, grotesque violence. It was, you saw this character that really could kick butt, like John Wick movie that would never end. But I was just kind of bored by it by really halfway through the first issue. I kept going though, not because of Keanu Reeves, although like many I'm a fan of Keanu Reeves. It was mostly because I did think Rob Garney was doing a good job with the art, and also I'm a huge Matt Kent fan, and I feel like Matt Kent was gonna say something additional, and I feel like we're just starting to see that with this issue. There was an inevitability to the way this narrative played out with this issue, as it's diving deeper into the past, ancient times, almost like weirdly like a Conan type of story, but I thought at least this had a bit of emotional core. And also really what got to me was the ending of this book, where everything else I kind of could see coming was pretty evident. It wasn't trying to hide where it was going, but the way this book ended, now I really don't know where things are going and where it can lead to, like what are the secrets that are being held back, because I wasn't really even looking for them, because I was just kind of focused on the general plot here. So that has me somewhat excited, and generally again the overall action was well executed. It was good to look at, and it was a fun quick read. It wasn't necessarily again the most dynamic. I think also expectations played a key role with the reason why it's in my top 10 this week. Again, I wasn't expecting much, and I ended up having somewhat of an emotional reaction to some of the deaths that take place. And I just thought, the story again wasn't trying to confuse you. The narrative was very calculated and telegraphed where it was going, but it did so, I think, in a way that was necessary, and I think a way that hopefully will lead to better stories moving forward. It also shows why sometimes it's good to keep with a book, because again, BRZRKR was a book that I thought was fine. It was enjoyable, it did its job, but I wasn't necessarily ever enthralled by it. But I did think there was potential there, especially looking at the talent, and I think with the fourth issue, finally we're seeing that. I just hope it can continue moving forward. Number 9 for me for this week is Black Widow number 9. No, I didn't necessarily plan that out, it just kind of worked out that way. Black Widow was one of my favorite comic books from Marvel last year and this year. I will say the second arc hasn't hit as strong as the first arc. I think the first arc had a little bit more going for it, because you had a more of an emotional bond there. You had a cold mystery aspect where it was almost like Twilight Zone, where Black Widow had this family and how did that happen. Now we're seeing somewhat of the fallout of that, but really the focus has shifted a great deal. You're bringing in Yelena, her sister, of course, because of the movie, but I do think she actually makes sense with this story without just feeling forced. But really, I think what I've been amazed by, just taking a step back with this issue, with this being issue number 9, within these last few issues, how much of a little family that they built around Black Widow. Very quick. Last arc had Hawkeye and Winter Soldier, and those were the main focus, and I thought they would stick with the book, but they lapped, which I was kind of sad about. But Now these new characters I think are just as strong, some of which have been in comics before, many which haven't, but even in the short time I feel like have been in really strong personalities and really interesting moral quandaries. So you have like the guy who got mixed up with the wrong crowd, now trying to right his wrongs, and it's just a combination of a nice little things where I think the narrative maybe not be as strong. I do think the character work might be even better this arc, and the art is always great. The action sequences are always beautiful to look at, very inventive. The page flow is great. So if you are a Black Widow fan, maybe you watch the movie, you want more Black Widow action, I definitely would advise checking this out. Check the first arc out. The first trade is available. You can jump on now. This issue I don't think you can jump on by itself without reading what came before. It's really building upon these last few issues, but it's really been a solid read. And I thought, like many, that this would just be a throwaway because, hey, Black Widow movie is coming out, let's do a series. It turned out to be actually quite a good book. Number 8 for me for this week is Shadow Doctor number 5, which brings an end to this series. Again, one of my favorite series of the year thus far. I do think, though, the last 2 issues are probably the weakest issues of the series thus far, just because it feels like it did rush a bit to the end. I really feel like this probably would have been better as a 10 to maybe 12 issue series because there's so much here. Still, though, I am very captivated by this story. It's about this true life events as a father is telling this story to his son that it was told to him by his grandfather. His grandfather grew up in the 1950s. He was a doctor, but he was having difficulties really being able to practice due to the racism of the time. He really couldn't get a loan or anything like that, but he did previously work for the mob, so he went to someone like Al Capone, got a loan, and was able to become this doctor, but also because of that, had to help out people like Al Capone, and as you're having all this mob violence, and just the economy of trying to be a doctor to help individuals when you have to do things that you're not necessarily proud of. And this was that kind of coming to a head as you see him kind of dealing with the fact that he's seeing all this violence take place, all these lives being lost brutally, explosions, bombs going off, innocent people being hurt. What do you do in that situation? Also knowing that now you have other mob bosses coming to him saying, hey, either you stop doing this or you help us out, or we take you and your family out. So it was this kind of complex situation, and again, all based upon true story. Now, how true is it? It's hard to tell, but it's still captivating and an interesting look at a time and place in which we don't necessarily see a lot of. It's very rare to get a monthly book like this, and I do think it's just an interesting investigation of what do you do when you're trying to do good and you really have no good place to go, and how institutional racism and things like that could lead to something like this, and the problems that are there, and what people had to sacrifice in order to kind of do what they feel like would be best for their community. The ultimate moral quandary in a way, and I thought it was investigated in an interesting way. I also thought the way this ended, the very last page, was fitting. It told you just enough. It didn't necessarily dive into have this magical ending. It all kind of made sense, and I was grateful for it. So I think this is one of the better books Aftershock has put out this year. One I would highly advise checking out, especially if you enjoy stories based on nonfiction. Number 7 for me for this week is Superman, Son of Kal-El, number 1, and I really like this issue. I wasn't really too surprised. It was kind of a book I was coming into with pretty high expectations because it's written by Tom Taylor and he's writing Jonathan Kent, and he's done some amazing Jonathan Kent stories, mostly with what he did with DC's. I thought he's been writing the best Jonathan Kent, in my opinion, seeing him in the world of DC's in the role of Superman, and now we're seeing that in whatever normal DC continuity is. This was an issue that was light on plot but heavy on character moments, and it started right from the beginning. As you have the Justice League fighting this attempted evasion, and you're wondering what exactly is going on. They're all trying to protect Superman, and for a second I thought it was because, oh, he's losing his power, so this is where that's coming by, and then realizing, oh no, it's actually a flashback, and when we see the birth of Jonathan Kent, which I don't know if we've actually ever saw that moment in the comics played out like this, but ultimately then we get the story that's focused on Jonathan Kent himself, and what exactly is he as Superman. And what's interesting is that the title is almost like half of a red herring in a way, where this is not just about Jonathan Kent being the son of Kal-El, the son of Superman, it's also about him being the son of Lois Lane. And what does that do to you? What does that give you in regarding your moral compass and your drive to do good? Superman, Clark Kent, clearly has a sense of morals, and so does Lois Lane, but they're very different. They're clearly similar, that's why they're so copacetic, but Lois Lane has a bit of a drive, really, where she's sticking up for the little guy, because she's doing, maybe pushing a little bit further, where Superman is a bit reserved. So where does that lead a person like Jonathan Kent that has both as parents? I think this seems to be investigating that question. And there's just great moments between Batman and Superman, and also Damian and Jonathan. I do think they maybe made Damian look a little older. I don't know if it's just to age them up, because now Jonathan is aged up, where they seem like the same age, but they're supposed to be different ages. I don't know. It's weird. Comics are weird. But I feel like for the first time, really since... Actually, I got to give Philip Kennedy Johnson credit, because I do think he helped kind of establish Jonathan Kent as the main focus of his run, and now he's getting his overall series. If you haven't read Superman, can you jump into this not knowing anything that's been going on? I think so. It does a good job of catching you up. Generally, this is just what type of Superman is Jonathan Kent going to be, and we see him asking that question and going through that, and by the end, we see that he's decided what he's going to try to achieve, and let's go from there. So generally a really solid first issue in establishing character and theme, and excited to see what comes next. 6 for me for this week is The Blue Flame #3, published by Vault Comics, written by Chris Cantwell, and art by Adam Gorham. And a lot of the books I talked about thus far are kind of your happy books, joyful books. Superman, Son of Kal-El kind of gives you that hope. The Blue Flame is not that. It is a very different type of storytelling, but still an effective type of storytelling. It's a book I feel like I might have a difficulty quantifying, because you kind of have two concurrent storylines. You have, this more human story of this guy who was the Blue Flame. It was like a real life hero that kind of they dressed up, did vigilante things, but they didn't have superpowers. It was in a world in which kind of not unlike our own. But after having a celebration, there was a mass shooting. Many of his friends were killed, many people were killed, and he was paralyzed, and now he's kind of dealing with those ramifications. At the same time, you have another story where you have the Blue Flame, who's kind of like a Green Lantern character in space. He's one of the last surviving humans, and he's kind of going around assigning different duties and things like that. And as a book, I think it's focusing on a number of key issues, one being the aspect of loss and how that impacts you. You have this one character who's kind of seen his world destroyed in front of him, people being gunned down, and another superhero again who may be a superhero, but he's dealing with the fact that he's isolated. He doesn't necessarily have anyone to connect to. His world has been kind of made a cinder in a way. So how does that impact him? And just showing that although these individuals may have superpowers and one may just be a normal human, the general pain that they're going through is uniform. And I think that makes sense, and it's a way to deconstruct and reconstruct superheroes at the same time. Art-wise, I think the art-wise is pretty solid. I think the art is best when it's telling the more human story. I think that's where it excels the most, because the emotion there, and it's dark and depressing, and it gets into some raw human emotion, because you see this individual taking care of his brother, and he's certainly dealing with depression and just anger and not knowing where to do it, and just seeing that how difficult that can be. They clash. They love each other, but there's still kind of an anger there, unresenting anger, and they're just trying to work through it, and it kind of bubbles to the head near the end. I don't know, I find this book really fascinating. I like when people can take the superhero genre and find new avenues for it. It's hard to do because there's been superhero comics for over 100 years, nearly 100 years at this point, but I do think the Blue Flame is doing that. Like I said, it's kind of a deconstruction of superheroes, not necessarily. It's I think more looking at the humanity of them, no matter where they're coming from, and just that aspect of loss. Really, a superhero piece I feel like is superfluous to just the general dilemma that's there, but it does add some interesting aspects to the story. So Chris Cantwell, to me, I've been really liking a lot of what Chris Cantwell's been doing in his Iron Man run. So I just really like the approach he has to individuals. He really writes good, broken characters, and that's been the case with this series thus far. Number 5 for me for this week is Usagi Yojimbo, The Dragon Spell of Conspiracy #2, and kind of a weird title, but a great book. And this could be somewhat of a cheat, because these Usagi Yojimbo stories are ones that have been released before, but are now being re-released, but colored in new fancy editions with golden covers. Hey, it's my list, I can do what I want. But mostly it gives me an opportunity to discuss Usagi Yojimbo, and also these are stories personally I haven't read, and what's really great about them is that one thing that's been consistent with Usagi Yojimbo is that it's a timeless story, and that's the case. This book could have come out 30 years ago, and it's just as good now as it was then. And recently, Stan Sakai won an Eisner for Best Continuing Series for Usagi Yojimbo, and deservingly so. I'm actually kind of glad that happened. I did not expect it to happen, but it's really good to see that. If you're looking to get in Usagi Yojimbo, this is a good series to jump into. This is the second issue, and what's really remarkable about this issue is that you see that classic clash between samurai and ninja, and I love the cartooning of Stan Sakai. I feel like saying that is a bit redundant in a way because he's such a prolific artist, and he's been, again, talking about Eisner's, deservingly so. But I always say this about Usagi Yojimbo, that if you're a comic book creator, you're someone who wants to write comics, wants to write stories, I highly advise reading Usagi Yojimbo comics, because what it does, it shows you how to tell stories through characters. Again, this is a book that's been around for over 30 years, yet someone like me, I just got into it a few years ago. Really, you can pick up the story despite the fact this character has a huge legacy and understand everything you need to. Really, you can pick up this issue itself without reading the first issue and get what you need. It's just the small details, understanding characters' motivations nearly all the time, you know, always having them drive forward to something, taking time with these characters to kind of let you understand what are they thinking, what do they want to do, and just kind of resetting things each and every time, but in a way that's not boring or redundant. It's kind of remarkable in so many ways. And again, then having really fun, interesting stories to tell within that. Again, you have, this is a one that has a lot of moving pieces with a lot of different characters. You know, there's betrayal. There, you know, Usagi Yojimbo comes across this town that's been slaughtered, so he buries these individuals, but then someone thinks he's the one that kills them, so now he has to try to fight for his honor, and it's just kind of these series of unfortunate events, but it leads to interesting stories. To top it all off, pretty soon we'll be getting a Netflix Usagi Yojimbo series as well, although I believe it's a different character and a different time from what I'm seeing, and kind of a different take on this world, which I'm all for. It seems like Stan Sakai is heavily involved in it as well, so if you kind of want to get into the ground floor before that series comes out, check out this book. Like I said, this is only the second issue, so you can jump on board really quickly, or you can jump onto the main book that's also going out, and it's also quite strong as well. Number 4 for me for this week is That Texas Blood, number 8, and I'm excited this series is back. I really enjoyed the first arc. Wasn't sure if this was a book that would ever come back, and now it has, focusing on a brand new story. And the first arc had a really strong sense of place, and you know, you really felt like you're part of this small Texas town. And now I think that's even more important based upon the way the story is going. And this is a story that very, very much feels true to life. And a big example of that is this relationship between the sheriff, who's like the main character, and his wife. I love the back and forth, and just the small details. They feel like real individuals. And why that's important is because in this arc, it's kind of going back into the history of this town, kind of asking the question of what's truly evil. Is this place evil? Is it rotten? Because years earlier, decades earlier, there was a murder with a satanic cult. A young child was killed, and perhaps due to the racist meaning. Why it's important to have that real life look is because with this arc, it's adding in and asking the question, is something supernatural happening? You know, it's one thing if you have a book that is supernatural from the beginning, or is clearly not true to life. You know, when ghosts or whatever may come up, it's no big deal. But when you have a book that feels very much true to life, it becomes out of place, but in a good way. It's like seeing your real world being transformed, and I think that's been slowly happening here. See these different sins of the past kind of coming back to haunt this individual. Not that he did anything bad, but it's just the town is just seeming not to get over what happened before. Even though they try to bury it, it's coming back. And I think that does speak to a lot of systemic issues in general, you know, about things that would often happen and kind of being, you know, put under the rug, forgot about, but eventually they will come back in a new way. So I do think you can jump onto this new arc. This is the second issue of the new arc and not have a problem. If you enjoyed things like Criminal, I know it's a bit reductive to compare it to something like Criminal because Jacob Phillips is, you know, the colorist of Criminal, and his father, Sean Phillips, was the artist, but it does have a similar feel. Although I think with this arc, it's even becoming more and more its own thing. I'm just really liking it, and if you are a fan of like the crime genre, definitely a must read. Number 3 for me for this week is Monolith number 3, and I will say that I didn't plan it 3 and 3 to kind of match up. That's just kind of happened this week, and I did read every issue of the series, so I think that helped in my overall enjoyment. But still, this was a very strong issue, and And this is coming from Magnetic Press, and they're known for taking, foreign comics, European comics, Southern American comics, even Korean comics, really comics from non-English speaking countries, translating them and making them available for American or English speaking countries, which I'm very much in favor of. So I really like this book, and the premise of it is actually a really high concept, simple story when you break it down, where you have this mom who's kind of went off on the deep end. She's got a lot of issues, and she went away with her son, and she took her husband's car. He gave it to her because he wanted her to be safe. It's just like super huge, like almost tank on the ground type of vehicle. It's this huge SUV, but she ends up kind of getting lost and in this desert like area, and it's future technology, so like you turn their car on and by utilizing this kind of phone app, but she gets locked out and her son is locked in the car and she can't open it because it's built like a tank. It's like indestructible. So she's trying to find ways to get in to save her son because the hot sun is beating down. She's worried that he's the dangers of that, and just rising temperatures as the night is turning into morning turning into evening. So she's doing everything she can and dealing with the fact that she's already dealing with a lot of human baggage to begin with, and you see her just fighting for the life of her child, in a way becoming a life in a way she never did. There's also a variety of art styles with this. At one point she's bitten by a snake and it causes her to hallucinate, and you see that on the page. It's a great way of like utilizing the visualization of comics to kind of depict that, not just making things like hard to read, but by vastly changing the styles, you were put in her headspace to kind of understand what's happening, and it's heart-pounding, it's thrilling. Like, I really was on the edge of my seat reading this because, I'm worried about this kid, and again, it's a very simple story, but it did a really good job of building around it. So at the heart of it, it's just trying to save this kid, but what it means to her personally and what it means to her life, it's even more there. So fascinating read. It's available on Comixology if you want to check it out. The physical version probably will be coming out soon. You may want to ask your local comic book store to order it for you, but specifically because Magnetic Press is not one that comic shops, especially if you have a smaller comic shop, is going to order. This is also a book I don't think designed to be released in issue format, although it doesn't necessarily feel like that. Pacing wise, it does work out. So whoever was behind editorial and it was like deciding where to start and stop each issue, it definitely worked here. And this has been a year of a lot of strong European comics, European artists coming in and doing fantastic work. We had Carmen, for example, and now this, and I love that we're getting more and more in that into the American landscape and getting more and more comics that are coming from other countries. I think it makes comics in general a lot stronger. For me for this week is the Old Guard Tales Through Time #4, and I've been enjoying this series thus far. It's basically taking a lot of the characters from the Old Guard and telling their individual histories. And the Old Guard is focusing on characters that are immortal, or kind of immortal, like they don't die, but they can at one time randomly. It's a good way of like having the aspect of being immortal, but with the stakes of death at the same time. And all the Tales Through Time series is focused on one or two characters, kind of short stories, and kind of delving into, the life of an individual when they've been around for a long time. And both of these stories kind of focus in on eras of like Civil War era United States, Western United States, things of that nature. And each series too has had different comic book creators a part of it. And going into this, actually even reading the story, I was like, this is really great. Like, I was really surprised how strong this is. Not that the book should be surprising, but I was like, wow, how good a read this is. And it caught me off guard, not to pun not intended. But then I looked to see who's writing this. I'm like, oh, of course. You have Matt Fraction, Steve Lever, David F. Walker, some of my personal favorite comic book writers, are now writing these two short stories. My favorite story of it was probably the opening story. Both were really good, but it focused on one of the, I can't remember her name because I stink with names, one of the female characters who, she doesn't age, but she is kind of married, having a relationship with an ex-slave, and they move out west, and they kind of grow old together. Well, he grows old, she stays the same, and they start to notice the town is clearly having more and more issues. When they first moved there, and it was, things were less settled, and it was more open space, the classic Old West, there wasn't as much of an issue. But now, more and more people are coming and bringing the prejudice with them, and now they become a target. And hoping to kind of alleviate that issue, she leaves, leaving him behind, of course, because eventually he's going to die, and she won't. And it's just moving. But then what we see is that maybe that's not going to solve the problem. It feels like a classic Western story. Maybe it's because actually I'm currently listening to the Long Box Heroes podcast, and they're going over a lot of the Jonah Hex storylines, and I felt this actually feels very much like a classic Jonah Hex storyline, where you have the person kind of feeling wronged and going back and enacting revenge. And you know, what westerns and revenge is a common theme, and you see that here in the second story too, dealing with a person who was a Confederate soldier, well, kind of, and you see the kind of him taking out his frustrations with the kind of issues of that time. Because when you have individuals that live forever, you see that they don't have that same type of perspective, that same inherent biases as those people of that specific time and era, and then what that can lead to when you have, you know, soldiers doing some evil thing. One of the best parts of this is that it's all self-contained. Even if you've never read an issue of the Old Guard, you can read it with no problem. I was worried when the series came out, because I get it, Old Guard was a successful film for Netflix. Now they're going to come out and, you know, do it again, and trying to just kind of capitalize on that. But it's actually yielded a really good comic, really good series, and I think this is probably by far my favorite addition to this series. So if you're a type of person that likes historical fiction, for example, and I definitely think this will be up your alley, even if you've never read anything Old Guard related before. We're down to it. My number one choice of the week thus far. It's actually kind of funny, because my number one shifted throughout. It was first Monolith. After I read that, I'm like, okay, it's going to be somewhat difficult to beat this. I really thought this was an effective issue. And then I read Old Guard, and that kind of came out of nowhere, and I really loved that. This book didn't come out of nowhere. It was one of my most anticipated books of the week, and it delivered. And it's BRZRKR Bill number 5. And this, to me, it encapsulates everything I love about Marvel Comics when Marvel Comics are done right. And it's not surprising, because this is Daniel Warren Johnson just going to town on so many different ways. It's full of action. He has an ability to, I think, really have a lot of motion and strength within his art. You have BRZRKR Bill, you know, fighting a god, and how do you make that fit on the page and feel epic? He does just that. You know, it feels fast, it feels powerful, even almost feels like this glorified wrestling match at a time, but in a good way. There's so many just standout moments like you feel like if this was in a movie, like cinematic moments where people would be standing up and cheering. It's humorous, it's fun, it's also heartfelt as well. This series has been just a gem from Marvel. I love the fact that Marvel gave Daniel Warren Johnson this series, although maybe give it is the wrong word. He earned this series with series like Extremity, Wonder Woman Dead Earth from last year, Murder Falcon, all that kind of led up to this, and it's been just everything I could have hoped. When we talk about art, we also talk about wanting dynamic art, and it's kind of hard to qualify. Reading Daniel Warren Johnson, looking at his art, that is dynamic art. The page is always exciting, picking exciting angles, utilizing scale in effective ways, utilizing the page turn in effective ways. This had a fantastic page turn piece where I'll just say Scourge played a major role. And again, the characters here were all really strong, from BRZRKR Bill to Scuttlebutt to Pip the Troll. There was just so much in this 5 issues, this ragtag group getting together. I've been really liking the Thor run. I thought, you know, Donny Cates has been doing a good job with that. It's kind of been off the shelves as of late, but I feel like this has stepped in and really took its place in a strong way. Not to take anything away from the other books I talked about. Like I said, I did like the other books a great deal, but at the end of the day, after I read this, I'm like, yeah, there's no beating this. This is easily my favorite book, and nothing else really came close to this level of excitement. It just gave me everything I want in the comic book experience, and it was great to see. It was a really solid week of comics. I know it's been a while since I've done a top 10. I was like, I wasn't sure what this week would be like, and there were a number of books. There's a number of books that could easily have made this top 10, like Meet in Korea number 3, that was really close, among other titles. So what were some of your favorite books of the week? Let me know. I mean, again, I'm sure some people will agree or disagree with me. That's perfectly fine. Let me know in the comment section below. There are a ton of comic book channels out there. There's a plethora of ones to choose from. I appreciate any view, any like, any comment. Thank you for all that. Just remember that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, keep reading.